In the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, behind climate-controlled glass and steel shelving that stretches into shadow, there exists a clay tablet that should not make sense. Catalogue number CBS, 20 centimeters tall, 20 centimeters tall. The colour of dried earth ochre fading to pale grey where minerals leached away over millennia. The surface worn smooth in places where ancient fingers touched it, rough where a scribe's reed stylus pressed too hard into wet clay 4,000 years ago. The tablet is broken. Roughly half remains. What survives contains 260 lines of Sumerian cuneiform script, wedge-shaped impressions, tiny, precise, deliberate, each mark a shadow cast in baked mud. The museum acquired this fragment during excavations at Nippur, the religious heart of ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq. Archaeologists pulled it from the earth in 1889, wrapped it in cloth, packed it in wooden crates, and shipped it across the Atlantic. For decades it sat in storage, one artifact among tens of thousands. When scholars finally translated the surviving text in the early 20th century, they found something that didn't fit the expected pattern. The tablet describes the creation of human beings, not symbolically, not poetically. The text reads like an incident report. It lists materials. It names the gods involved, the Anunnaki. It specifies the location where the work occurred. It describes what existed before humanity, why the decision was made to create people, and what happened immediately after the first humans drew breath. The Sumerians wrote this as if reporting events. Before you fall asleep tonight, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Just the city, or the country, if you prefer. I'm curious how far these ancient words can travel. Now, here is what makes CBS 106107-3 genuinely strange. The text does not read like mythology. Mythology typically explains why things are the way they are through stories of gods behaving like amplified humans, jealous, passionate, creative, destructive. The flood comes because the gods are angry. The sun rises because a deity drags it across the heavens. Humans suffer because someone ate forbidden fruit or opened a forbidden box. Mythology makes sense of chaos through narrative. But CBS 106107-3 does something different. The surviving sections describe a procedural problem that required a technical solution. The gods, according to the tablet, were engaged in exhausting physical labour. They grew tired, they protested, they refused to continue. The senior gods convened, discussed options, and decided to create a substitute workforce, beings capable of performing the labour so the gods could rest. The text then describes how this creation occurred, not through a word spoken into void, not through divine thought made manifest, but through a process-specific materials combined in a particular location under the supervision of deities with specialized knowledge. The tablet treats the creation of humanity as engineering. Sit with that for a moment. The oldest civilizations we know, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all have creation myths. But most are grand, vague, cosmic. Light separates from darkness, waters divide, deities mate and give birth to the world. These are origin stories in the style of poetry, of dream logic, of metaphor. The Sumerian accounts are different. They are specific, procedural, technical. They describe materials, clay from the earth, blood or essence from a slaughtered god. They name the location, the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm beneath the city of Eridu. They identify the operators, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who designed the process, Ninmah, the goddess of birth, who performed the procedure, and a group of wise and learned goddesses who acted as assistants. They describe method. The materials were mixed, shaped, treated with incantations, placed on a birth brick, and gestated for a specified duration. And here is the detail that makes scholars pause. The text described failures. Early prototypes that didn't work. Experimental variations with specific defects. Beings who couldn't control their bladders, or were barren or lacked cognitive function. The process was iterative. It required adjustment. This doesn't sound like theology. It sounds like documentation. If you have encountered simplified versions of these stories before, perhaps in documentaries about ancient astronauts or in articles dismissing such ideas as fringe pseudoscience, you might already feel skeptical. That's reasonable. Skepticism is healthy. We should demand evidence. But skepticism is not the same as dismissal, because here is what the evidence shows. Multiple Sumerian and Akkadian tablets, excavated from different cities, created across different centuries, preserved in different museums around the world, describe the creation of humanity in remarkably consistent terms. The story doesn't drift the way oral myths tend to drift. The core details remain stable. Clay, blood, Abzu, Enki, Ninmah, labour, procedure. What if these texts are not myths in the way we typically understand mythology? What if the Sumerians were not inventing stories to explain their origins, but recording, to the best of their ability, events they believed had actually occurred? What if they were preserving knowledge passed down across generations, memories of something that happened before their civilization began, something they did not fully understand but felt compelled to document accurately? What if the Sumerians were writing history? The scribes who pressed these cuneiform marks into wet clay were not primitive. They were trained professionals, literate, numerate. They kept detailed economic records, grain inventories, tax receipts, labour logs. They tracked astronomical observations with precision, predicting lunar eclipses centuries in advance. They recorded legal contracts, medical procedures, architectural plans. They documented their world with bureaucratic thoroughness. And among all these practical records, alongside the beer rations and property transfers and star charts, they also wrote down the story of where humanity came from. They placed these creation accounts in the same archives as their administrative documents. They copied them carefully across centuries, preserving the text even as languages evolved and empires fell. CBS 1063 is one fragment of this larger archive, but it is not alone. Over the past 150 years, archaeologists have recovered thousands of tablets describing similar events. They rest now in museums across the world: Philadelphia, London, Oxford, Paris, Berlin, Baghdad, Istanbul. Different tablets, different excavation sites, different time periods, different scribal hands. They tell the same story. The gods, specifically a group called the Anunnaki in Sumerian theology, created human beings by combining clay with the blood or essence of a god. The process occurred in the Abzu. A goddess named Ninmah, identified in multiple texts as having specialized knowledge of childbirth and healing, supervised the work. The first attempts failed. Adjustments were made. Eventually, functional humans emerged, capable of labor, reproduction, and survival, but deliberately limited in other capacities. Mortal, obedient, designed. This is what the tablets say. Not through one questionable source, but through multiple independent accounts that corroborate each other's details across centuries. So the question this investigation will explore is simple. Why? Why did the Sumerians describe human origins this way? Why such specific procedural detail? Why mention materials and locations and supervisory deities? Why describe experimental failures? Why frame creation as a process rather than a miracle? Three interpretations present themselves. First, pure mythology. The Sumerians invented creative stories to explain existence, using divine action as metaphor for theological truths. The gods represent cosmic principles. The creation process symbolizes the emergence of civilized humanity from pre-cultural savagery. This is mainstream scholarship's position, and it has substantial merit. Second, encoded wisdom. The texts preserve genuine insights about human nature, consciousness, or existence, but express them through symbolic narrative. The story is a teaching, not a report. It requires interpretation to extract the embedded truth. Third, historical memory. The Sumerians were recording, as accurately as their language allowed, actual events that occurred before their civilization began. They described what they had been told or what they had witnessed using the only conceptual vocabulary available to them. Clay and divine blood and underground workshops because they lacked any other framework for explaining biological processes they did not understand. Mainstream scholarship strongly favours the first interpretation. The texts are mythology, rich with meaning but not literally true. This position is well-reasoned, evidence-based and widely accepted. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain the technical specificity. It does not explain why the Sumerians repeatedly, across multiple independent texts, described procedural steps rather than simply stating the gods made humans. It does not explain the experimental phase, the failed prototypes, the iterative adjustments. It does not explain why certain details, mixing of materials, specialized location, supervisory role of a medically knowledgeable goddess, appear consistently in sources created centuries apart by scribes who never met. What if the third interpretation deserves consideration? Not certainty, not blind belief, but consideration. What if the Sumerians were attempting to preserve, in the only language available to them, memories of biological modification? What if clay mixed with divine blood was their best description for processes they witnessed or inherited knowledge of but could not scientifically explain? This is not a claim that ancient aliens visited Earth. This is not an assertion that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials conducting genetic experiments. Those interpretations may exist, but they are not our focus. The question here is narrower and more careful. Do the Sumerian creation texts preserve technical memories rather than pure mythology? We will examine the evidence. We will cite specific tablets, catalogue numbers, archaeological contexts, scholarly interpretations. We will move slowly through the details, the materials, the procedures, the locations, the failures, the successes. We will consider what mainstream scholarship says and why it says it, and we will ask quietly whether there might be another layer beneath the accepted answers. The clay tablet in Philadelphia has no opinion. It simply is. Baked earth, impressed with marks, silent in its archive. But those marks form words, and the words describe something. Whether that something is myth, metaphor, or memory is the question we carry forward. Wherever you are, let the night settle around you. Let your breathing slow. The story begins 4,000 years ago, in the cities of Sumer, where the first written words were pressed into clay tablets that would outlast everything their creators knew. And it begins with a problem the gods could not solve alone. Before the gods were myths. The land between the rivers emerged slowly from sea and marsh. Sediment accumulated over millennia where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers met the Persian Gulf, building terrain grain by grain. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, fertile plains stretched across what is now southern Iraq. Flat, rich with river deposits, ideal for agriculture but lacking stone, timber and metal. A landscape of clay and water and reeds. Someone came to this place and built cities. We call them Sumerians. They called themselves the Black-Headed People. By 3500 BCE, urban settlements existed at Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash and other sites across the southern Mesopotamian plain. These were not villages. They were cities with monumental architecture, complex social hierarchies, specialized labor, extensive trade networks, and centralized administration. And they wrote things down. The Sumerians developed cuneiform writing around 3200 BCE, initially to track economic transactions. But the system quickly evolved beyond accounting. Within centuries, scribes were recording literary compositions, religious hymns, legal codes, medical procedures, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and historical chronicles. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian civilization had reached remarkable sophistication. The city of Uruk alone may have housed 50,000 people. Massive temple complexes, ziggurats rose above the flat plains. Irrigation systems channeled river water to fields. Ships travelled the Persian Gulf trading for materials unavailable in Mesopotamia. The scribes recorded all of it. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets survive, pulled from ancient ruins by archaeologists over the past 150 years. The tablets provide an unprecedented window into Bronze Age society. Among these practical records, the Sumerians also preserved religious and literary texts, hymns to gods, epic poems about legendary kings, proverbs and wisdom literature. And, significantly for our investigation, multiple accounts of how the world and humanity came to be. These creation narratives appear on tablets excavated from different sites across Sumer. The Weld Blundell prism, now in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, was found at Lhasa in 1922. This four-sided clay prism, catalogue number AN 1923, 444, stands 20 centimetres tall and dates to approximately 1800 BCE. One entire side contains the Sumerian king list, a chronological record of kingship in Sumer, beginning with the statement, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." The king list then names 8 kings who ruled before a great flood. Their reign lengths are extraordinary. Alulim of Eridu ruled 28,800 years. Alalaja ruled 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled 40,200 years. The list continues through 8 rulers totaling 200 years, then states, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood, reign lengths drop dramatically to decades or centuries rather than tens of thousands of years. The Barton cylinder, catalogue number CBS 8383 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, was excavated at Nippur in 1889. This cylindrical clay tablet dates to approximately 2600–235 BCE and contains a Sumerian creation hymn describing the activities of gods in primordial times. These tablets come from archaeological contexts that scholars can date with reasonable confidence. They were created by scribes working within identifiable cultural and historical periods. They were preserved in temple archives and palace libraries. When cities were destroyed or abandoned, these tablets survived in the ruins until modern archaeologists recovered them. This archaeological context matters enormously. The creation accounts we are investigating are not late compositions. They are primary sources created by Sumerian scribes in the Sumerian language during the height of Sumerian civilization. They are internal records made by the culture itself for its own purposes. What purposes? Scribes did not write randomly. Clay tablets required labour preparing clay, forming tablets, impressing text with reed stylus, sometimes firing to preserve permanently. Writing was a specialised skill requiring years of training. Creating a tablet consumed time, materials, and expertise. Scribes wrote what their society considered important enough to preserve. Economic records made sense. Legal texts made sense. Medical texts made sense. Religious texts also made sense. Temples employed scribes to maintain religious archives, ensuring knowledge passed accurately from one generation to the next. The temples were repositories of cultural memory, centres of learning where scribes trained and texts accumulated. Within this religious literature, creation narratives occupied a special category. They explained fundamental questions. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? What is our relationship to the divine realm? Most cultures develop creation myths. The Sumerian creation accounts fit this pattern in some ways. They describe gods acting in primordial times. They explain cosmic structures. They establish theological hierarchies. But they also contain elements that seem oddly specific for pure mythology. They name precise locations where events occurred, not generic settings, but specific places like the Abzu or Nippur. They specify which gods participated and what roles each played. They describe processes and procedures, mixing materials, forming shapes, conducting trials, making corrections. This specificity becomes more striking when examining multiple creation accounts. Rather than each text presenting a completely different story, the Sumerian and Akkadian creation narratives share core elements while varying in details. Different texts focus on different aspects of the same basic narrative framework. Consider the consistency across time and space. The Barton cylinder was created before 2500 BCE. The Weld-Blundell prism dates to around 1800 BCE, perhaps 700 years later. Other creation texts span even broader periods. These tablets were created across more than 1,000 years. They were written in different cities, composed in different languages, produced during different political periods. Yet they maintain consistent core elements. This consistency suggests underlying stability. Not constant creative reinvention, but careful preservation of established narratives. Scribes were copying, translating, and transmitting texts they regarded as authoritative accounts of primordial events. Why did they regard these accounts as authoritative? One possibility is purely theological. These were sacred narratives. Another possibility is historical. These accounts preserved information passed down through generations, information that earlier peoples considered factual. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires examining what the texts actually say about creation. But first we must address, how do we know what the texts say? Cuneiform remained undeciphered until the 19th century. The breakthrough came through trilingual inscriptions, particularly the Behistun inscription from ancient Persia. By comparing Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian versions, scholars gradually cracked the code. Sumerian proved more difficult as it was a language isolate. But Akkadian scribes had created Sumerian, Akkadian dictionaries and bilingual texts as teaching tools. Using these ancient resources, scholars slowly reconstructed Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Assyriologists had developed sophisticated abilities to read cuneiform texts. Modern translations are collaborative efforts drawing on multiple scholars' work. The Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, ETCSL, provides scholarly translations based on careful examination of multiple tablet sources. Academic journals publish new translations and debate interpretive questions. The translations we will reference come from this scholarly tradition. Mainstream academic Assyriology, not fringe interpretations. Where scholarly disagreement exists, we will note those debates. With that foundation established, we can begin examining the creation accounts themselves. Multiple tablets describe how humanity came to be, and while they vary in details, they present a remarkably consistent core narrative. That narrative begins not with humans, but with the gods and the problem they faced. A problem that required a solution involving the creation of something new, something designed to serve a specific function. The Sumerians called this creation humanity. But before we existed, according to the tablets, there was work to be done, work that the gods themselves found burdensome, work that eventually prompted them to devise an alternative. The language of creation. When the Sumerian scribe pressed reed stylus to wet clay and wrote the word for human, the symbol consisted of wedge-shaped impressions in a specific pattern. The Sumerian word was lu for male, munus for female, or namlu for humanity in general. These were not abstract concepts, but specific terms denoting physical beings who existed in the world. When that scribe wrote about the creation of these beings, he chose words carefully. Sumerian possessed rich vocabulary with precise distinctions. The language could express metaphor and poetry. It could also express concrete actions, physical materials, and procedural steps. The question becomes, which mode appears in the creation texts? The Atrahasis epic provides our most detailed creation account. This Akkadian text, with the most complete version dating to around 1700 BCE, draws on earlier Sumerian traditions. The British Museum houses fragment BM 78943. Scholars have pieced together substantial sections by combining overlapping copies. The epic begins with cosmological background. The gods are divided, the senior gods called the Anunnaki, and the junior gods called the Igigi. The Igigi gods are tasked with digging irrigation canals, dredging rivers, and performing heavy agricultural labour. The text describes the Igigi digging with tools, carrying baskets of earth, working without rest. After 40 years, some translations say 40 periods, the Igigi gods rebel. They burn their tools, they march to Enlil, the chief administrator, and demand relief. The text records their complaint: the toil is too great, we cannot go on. This creates a crisis. The labour must continue, but the workers refuse. Enlil initially responds with anger, but Enki, the god of wisdom and craftsmanship, proposes a solution. The text records his speech. While the birth goddess is present, let her create humanity. Let man bear the yoke of the gods. The word yoke is significant. The Akkadian term is dalu, work, labour, toil. Enki proposes creating substitutes to bear this burden. The creation of humanity is explicitly framed as solving a labour shortage. The assembly agrees. But creation requires procedure. Enki addresses Nintu, the birth goddess. You are the birth goddess, creatress of mankind. Create Loluman that he may bear the yoke. Nintu responds that she cannot accomplish this alone. She requires Enki's assistance. It is not proper for me to make him. The task is Enki's. He purifies all things. Let him give me the clay so I can make him. This passage introduces the first material requirement, clay. The Akkadian word is du, literally earth, soil, or clay. This is the same word used for clay tablets, for mud bricks in construction, for the physical substance of Mesopotamia. But clay alone is insufficient. The text continues, Enki opened his mouth and addressed the great gods. On the 1st, 7th, and 15th of the month I shall make a purification by washing. Then one god shall be slaughtered, and from his flesh and blood Nintu shall mix clay. That god and man shall be mixed together in the clay. Here the text specifies a second material, divine blood or essence. The Akkadian uses damu, blood, and namu, mu, personality, essence, or divine qualities. A god must be slaughtered so his substance can be mixed with the clay. The text identifies which god, Geshtu-A, also called Wi-Ilu, described as a god who has rationality, or possesses intelligence. The term is Nimu. This god possesses the quality that will be transferred to humanity. The text states, they slaughtered Geshtu-E, a god who had intelligence. From his flesh and blood, Nintu mixed clay. The language is surgical, procedural. A specific god is selected because he possesses a specific attribute. That attribute is extracted through his slaughter. The material is combined with clay. The text becomes even more specific about the mixing process. She mixed the clay, and she sang an incantation. Enki was present as he made her recite it. When she had finished her incantation, she pinched off 14 pieces of clay. 7 she placed on the right, 7 she placed on the left. Between them she placed the birth brick. The birth brick was an actual object used in Mesopotamian birthing practices. 2 bricks placed on the ground with space between them, over which a woman would squat during labour. Nintu is described as using actual equipment of childbirth. The text then describes a gestation period. The 14 clay pieces remain in this configuration for a specified time. When the process completes, the text records, the birth goddess brought forth the winds of life. In pairs they completed them. The forms of the people Nintu fashioned. The Sumerian version, Enki and Ninmah, provides additional procedural details. The narrative structure differs. It frames creation as emerging from a banquet where gods have been drinking, but the core elements align. Enki responds to complaints about divine labour by describing a creation process. The creatures whose name my mother uttered, their birth-giving, is in the hands of Ninmah. When she has added the birth-giving of the gods to it, let her mould the birth-giving of man. The text then describes Ninmah's work. Ninmah took the birth-giving of the gods. In her hand she held the fate of mankind. Before Enki she tore off 14 pieces of clay. 7 she placed on the right, 7 she placed on the left. Between them she placed a brick. The parallel to Atrahasis is striking. The same number, 14, the same division, 7 and 7, the same birth brick placement. Either one text copied the other, or both draw on an established tradition that specified these exact procedural details. But Enki and Ninmah continues with material absent from Atrahasis, a creation contest where things go wrong. After successful creation of the first 14 humans, Enki and Ninmah begin drinking beer and become intoxicated. Ninmah boasts she can make human forms, good or bad, as she pleases. She creates 6 defective humans. 1 who cannot hold his urine, 1 who is barren, 1 neither male nor female, and others with impairments. For each, Enki assigns social roles that accommodate the limitations. Then, Enki challenges Ninmah to accommodate a human he creates. He fashions a being who is decrepit, broken, unable to function. Ninmah cannot help this creation. She throws down her clay, declaring, "Enki has made something impossible." This contest section seems at first like comic relief, but consider what it implies. The text describes failed prototypes, experimental variations, the process of discovering what combinations produce viable results versus defective ones. This is engineering narrative, trial, error, correction, refinement. Why would purely metaphorical mythology include such details? If the creation account encodes theological truths about divine power, why specify that some creations failed? Why describe intoxicated gods making mistakes? Why include technical problems that required solutions? The language throughout these texts remains concrete rather than obviously metaphorical. When Akkadian texts use damu, blood, that word appears in other contexts meaning literal blood, sacrificial blood, menstrual blood, blood from wounds. When Sumerian texts use clay, that word appears in economic texts inventorying actual clay, in architectural texts specifying clay for bricks. Similarly, the verbs used to describe creation are physical action verbs. The Akkadian balalu means to mix, mingle, combine, the same verb used for mixing ingredients in beer making or combining metals in bronze production. The Sumerian daim means to fashion, shape, form, the verb used for pottery making and sculpture. These are manufacturing terms, not spiritual abstractions. The locations specified are also concrete. The Abzu refers to the underground freshwater realm, Enki's domain. In Sumerian cosmology, this was an actual place, the subterranean waters that fed wells and springs. The Abzu could be accessed through certain locations, particularly at Eridu. The text described creation occurring in the Abzu, specifying a location rather than indicating creation happened everywhere or nowhere. When texts name the gods involved, they specify individuals with defined roles. Enki is the god of wisdom, water, crafts, and magic. Ninmah is the birth goddess, associated with pregnancy, childbirth, and medical knowledge. Each deity has specialized knowledge relevant to their participation. This specialization matters. In Mesopotamian theology, gods were not omnipotent. Each had domains of expertise and limitations. Creation required collaboration between gods with different specializations. Enki provided technical plan, Ninmah provided birth knowledge, Enlil gave authorization. Moreover, the texts indicate the knowledge required wasn't obvious or universal. In Atrahasis, Nintu initially responds that she cannot do it alone, that Enki must provide essential components. The texts don't present creation as simple divine will, let there be humans, but as a technical challenge requiring specialized knowledge. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets in the British Museum, provides a different perspective. This text focuses on Marduk's rise to supremacy through defeating the chaos goddess Tiamat, but includes a creation passage in Tablet the 6. After Marduk defeats Tiamat, the gods gather to honor him. Marduk addresses the assembly. Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they may be at ease. The term savage, Akkadian lulla, is the same word used in Atrahasis. Marduk proposes creating beings to serve the gods. But Marduk doesn't perform creation directly. Instead, Ea Enki implements the procedure. It was Chingu who contrived the uprising. They bound him, holding him before Ea. They imposed on him his guilt and severed his blood. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods. Chingu was Tiamat's general in the war against Marduk. His blood becomes the material for human creation, specifically his blood, not any god's blood, just as Atrahasis specified Geshtu. The text suggests that the particular god whose essence is used matters, affecting the nature of created beings. Across these major creation accounts, Atrahasis, Enki, and Ninmah, and Enuma Elish core elements remain consistent. Humanity is created to serve as labourers. The process involves mixing materials, clay and divine blood. Specialized deities oversee the procedure. The process occurs in a specific location, and the result is beings designed for function. The language used is procedural, technical, and specific. It names materials, specifies quantities, describes mixing and shaping actions, indicates waiting periods, and acknowledges failures that required correction. Mythology typically operates through broad strokes and cosmic imagery. Gods speak worlds into existence. Divine beings shape reality through will or conflict. Details about procedure, materials, and specialized knowledge are generally absent because mythology explains ultimate causes rather than intermediate steps. But Sumerian creation accounts include intermediate steps. They specify not just that gods created humans, but how, through what process, using what materials, following what sequence, under whose supervision, with what challenges. This distinction becomes critical when evaluating what these texts might preserve. If the Sumerians were inventing creation myths for theological meaning, why encode so much procedural detail? Why specify exact numbers of clay pieces? Why mention failed prototypes? Why emphasize material components and specialized expertise? Alternative explanations suggest themselves. Perhaps the procedural details served ritual purposes. Priests reenacted creation ceremonies requiring exact steps. Perhaps details conveyed theological truths through symbolic encoding. These explanations have merit, but they don't fully account for the specificity. Ritual texts typically focus on what participants should do. Creation narratives focus on what the gods did in primordial times. The procedural details describe divine actions, not human ritual replications. What if the texts mean exactly what they say? What if the Sumerians were recording, to the best of their linguistic ability, a process they believed had actually occurred? A process involving material combination, supervised procedure, experimental trials, and successful production of beings that had not previously existed. This interpretation doesn't require ancient aliens or scientifically advanced lost civilizations. It simply suggests the Sumerians treated their creation accounts as historical records rather than symbolic mythology. They preserved detailed procedural information because they believed those details were accurate representations of how humanity came to be. Whether the Sumerians were correct is a separate question from whether they believed they were recording historical events. The language they chose, the specificity they included, the consistency they maintained across multiple texts spanning centuries, all suggest they were attempting to preserve factual information. Modern readers must decide what to make of this testimony. We can dismiss it as primitive mythology. We can interpret it symbolically. Or we can take it seriously as an attempt at historical documentation, flawed by limited scientific vocabulary, but genuine in its intention to record actual procedures and events. The language of the texts supports this third interpretation more readily than mainstream scholarship typically acknowledges. The Sumerians wrote as if describing reality, using technical terminology. specifying materials and procedures, maintaining consistency across time and sources. Whether the facts they recorded are facts as we would understand them, that remains the question. But the language itself suggests that when Sumerian scribes wrote about clay and divine blood mixing to create humanity, they meant clay and blood, mixture and creation, procedure and result. The reed stylus pressed into wet clay. The cuneiform marks remained. The tablets survived, and the words they preserved describe not theological abstractions but materials, locations, procedures and outcomes, the language of documentation rather than the language of myth. The Assembly's decision. The tablets are explicit. Humanity did not exist at the beginning. The cosmos formed through divine generation, but humans had no place in this early cosmos. The work of maintaining cosmic order fell to divine beings themselves. Specifically, according to multiple texts, this work fell to the Igigi gods. The Igigi appear throughout Mesopotamian literature as a class of younger deities subordinate to the great Anunnaki gods who form the divine council. What remains consistent is their role. The Igigi were labourers. The Atrahasis epic describes their work in detail. For 40 years the Igigi gods toiled. They dug the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, creating channels through which waters would flow to irrigate the land. They dredged canals. They carried baskets heavy with earth. They worked under harsh supervision without rest. The text doesn't explain why divine beings require physical effort, but Mesopotamian theology didn't work that way. Gods possess power far beyond humans, yet remain limited. They must eat and drink. They can be injured. They require rest. They experience exhaustion. They are not omnipotent abstractions, but powerful beings operating within physical reality. The Atrahasis epic records their rebellion. The work was hard. The distress was great. Man's misery was great. The suffering was heavy. They complained, grumbled and gossiped. Eventually, complaint escalates to action. The Igigi gather in secret. They plan insurrection. Come, let us carry the war god. Let us break the yoke. They burn their tools, actually set fire to the implements of their labour. They march at night to Enlil's dwelling. They surround the great house. Calcul, the doorkeeper, reports to Enlil, "My lord, your house is surrounded. A rabble has run up to your gate." Enlil summons Anu the sky god and Enki the wisdom god. These three form the supreme triad of the Anunnaki council. Enlil is shaken, uncertain how to respond. Anu suggests sending Nusku, Enlil's minister, to ask the Igigi what they want. The Igigi respond collectively. Every single one of us gods has declared war. The work is too hard. The distress is too great. Now we have had enough. The Divine Council must now make a decision. They face a genuine crisis. The workers have refused to work. The work must continue, and fighting the rebels would solve nothing. Without the Igigi performing labour, cosmic order will deteriorate. Enlil's initial reaction is anger. He considers punishing the rebels. But Enki recognizes this crisis requires creative solution rather than forceful suppression. The text records the crucial moment when Enki proposes the solution. Why are we blaming them? Their work was hard. Their distress was great. Enki validates the Igigi's grievance. He acknowledges the work truly is too burdensome, but he also recognizes the work cannot simply cease. The solution must involve finding alternative workers. And so, Enki makes his proposal. While the birth goddess is present, let her create man. Let man bear the labour of the gods. This moment is pivotal. Enki is proposing the deliberate creation of new beings designed specifically to perform labour too burdensome for gods. Humans will exist not as cosmic necessities or theological essentials, but as functional solutions to an administrative problem. We will be engineered workers, substitute labourers, beings created to free divine beings from toil they can no longer endure. The text doesn't present this as humanity's highest purpose. It presents it as our reason for existing. We are to bear dalu, the same word used for the Igigi's labour. Our function is replacement, substitution, taking on burden that others refuse to carry. The divine assembly considers Enki's proposal. Eventually, consensus emerges. The assembly agrees. Let the birth goddess create humanity. Let humans bear the work. Authorization granted, the project moves to implementation. But creating beings capable of bearing divine labor requires more than simple manufacture. The beings must be strong enough to work, intelligent enough to understand instruction, durable enough to sustain themselves, and numerous enough to replace hundreds of Ijiji laborers. The texts suggest this wasn't straightforward. In Enki and Ninmah, the creation process involves experimentation, failures, corrections. Even in Atrahasis, the careful specification of procedures implies that getting creation right requires technical knowledge and careful execution. Why would mythology include such details? If the point is simply to explain that gods made humans, why elaborate the reasoning, the labor crisis, the assembly deliberation, the procedural requirements? The detail suggests these texts preserve institutional memory of decision-making processes. Someone decided that creating humanity was necessary. That decision emerged from a genuine problem requiring solution. The problem was labor-intensive work that existing workers couldn't sustain. The solution was engineering new workers capable of bearing that load. The texts frame this as divine deliberation, because that is the conceptual framework available to Sumerian scribes. But strip away the theological vocabulary and a coherent narrative remains. A powerful group faced unsustainable labour demands. Junior members refused to continue. Senior members deliberated alternatives. A technically skilled member proposed creating substitute workers. The assembly authorised the project. Implementation began. This narrative structure, problem, crisis, deliberation, proposal, authorization, implementation, is not typical of mythology. It is typical of institutional history, of records documenting how decisions were made and projects were initiated. The Sumerian scribes were maintaining precisely this kind of institutional memory, treating the creation of humanity as a specific historical project undertaken for practical reasons by identifiable actors using technical procedures. That purpose, according to the texts, is labour. Humanity exists to work, to maintain irrigation systems, cultivate fields, construct buildings, produce goods. The texts present it matter-of-factly. Gods needed workers. Workers were created. Those workers are us. Modern theological sensibilities often resist this origin story. We prefer narratives where humanity exists for nobler purposes. A story where we exist primarily as substitute labourers seems demeaning. But the Sumerian texts show no such concern. They present human labour as valuable and necessary. By taking on work that gods couldn't sustain, humanity enables cosmic order to continue. Our labour sustains the system. That is our purpose and contribution. This functional origin has implications. If humanity was deliberately created for specific purposes, then human capacities were presumably designed to match those purposes. We needed to be strong enough to dig and carry, intelligent enough to understand instruction, durable enough to sustain years of labour, but perhaps not more than necessary. Our design reflects our function. The texts hint at this design limitation in various ways. The Adapa myth describes a human given wisdom, but denied immortality. Capabilities granted, match function, immortality is withheld. The Atrahasis epic mentions that humanity's reproductive rate becomes problematic, prompting gods to limit human lifespan through disease and infant mortality to control population. If humans were deliberately created rather than naturally evolving, then our biology presumably shows evidence of that deliberate creation. Our capabilities and limitations should reflect conscious design decisions. Modern scientific understanding holds that humans evolved through natural selection over millions of years. This evolutionary origin explains human biology through materialistic mechanisms without requiring conscious design. But the Sumerian texts assert conscious design. They describe deliberate decisions about what humanity should be capable of doing, followed by technical procedures to create beings matching those specifications. These perspectives seem irreconcilable. Either humans evolved naturally, or we were consciously designed. Either the Sumerian creation accounts are mythological explanations, or they preserve memory that complicates purely evolutionary origin. This tension cannot be easily resolved. But examining what the Sumerian texts say about the creation procedure itself, the materials used, the techniques employed, the specialized knowledge required, may provide additional perspective. The assembly decided. The authorization was granted. The project moved forward. And in the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm where Enki maintained his domain, the work of creating humanity began. Work that would involve mixing materials, shaping forms, supervising gestation, and addressing failures before achieving success. The procedure in the Abzu Enki's realm lay beneath the earth, in waters that fed springs and wells and rivers. The Sumerians called this place the Abzu, the deep waters that contained wisdom and life. This was not metaphorical water. The Abzu was a specific location within Sumerian cosmology, accessible through certain sanctuaries, particularly at Eridu. The Abzu, House of the Abzu, rose as a temple complex in Eridu. Archaeological excavations at Tel Abu Sharain have revealed successive temple structures dating to the 6th millennium BCE, long before Sumerian civilization proper emerged. The Sumerians regarded Eridu as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the original site of divine human contact. That Enki's creation workshop was located in the Abzu establishes the creation of humanity as occurring at a real place with continuing cultic significance. The texts are not setting creation in a timeless void, but in a location that Sumerians could visit. The Atrahasis epic describes what happened in the Abzu after the divine assembly authorized Enki's proposal. Enki summons Ningtu and explains what must be done. Ningtu, you are the birth goddess, creatress of humankind. Create human beings that they may bear the yoke. Ningtu responds, it is not possible for me to make it, the work is Enki's. Since he can make everything pure, let him give me the clay, and I will do it. This exchange establishes crucial division of labour. Enki possesses knowledge that Nintu lacks, specifically knowledge of how to purify or prepare materials. Nintu possesses knowledge Enki needs, knowledge of birth-giving, of transforming prepared materials into living beings. Creation requires both sets of expertise working together. Enki accepts and begins preparing materials. Enki opened his mouth and addressed the great gods. On the 1st, 7th, and 15th of the month, I shall make a purification by washing. Then one god should be slaughtered, and the gods can be purified by immersion in his flesh and blood. Let Nintu mix clay from his flesh and blood. Several elements demand attention. First, temporal specification. Creation will occur on particular days, days associated with ritual purification in Mesopotamian practice. This suggests planned procedure requiring proper timing. Second, purification requirement. Enki will perform ritual washing, preparing for the work ahead. This suggests creation requires purity or proper ritual state. Third, material requirement. A god must be slaughtered to provide essential components. The Akkadian verb indicates execution, killing to obtain required materials. Fourth, the mixing instruction. Nintu will combine clay with flesh and blood from the slaughtered god. The verb balalu is the same used in recipes and metallurgy. It indicates thorough combination, creating a new substance with properties different from constituent parts. The text identifies which god will be slaughtered. We Ilu, who has rationality, they slaughtered in their assembly. From his flesh and blood, Nintu mixed clay. We, Ilu, also called Geshtu, is described as possessing mu, rationality, understanding, intelligence. This god is selected specifically because he has the quality humans will need. His slaughter is not arbitrary punishment, but functional harvesting. The required attribute must be extracted from a donor who possesses it. This logic of attribute transfer appears throughout Mesopotamian magical and medical texts. Sympathetic magic operates on the principle that consuming or incorporating part of something grants its properties. The creation account applies similar logic. Incorporating the flesh and blood of an intelligent god transfers intelligence to humans. But the texts go further, describing not just material harvesting, but procedural implementation. After Wee-Ilu's slaughter, Nintu begins working. Nintu mixed clay. In her hands she was holding the flesh and blood. She was reciting an incantation, for Enki was present with her as she was reciting it. Incantation accompanied procedure. Nintu spoke specific words while performing specific actions. The Akkadian term chiptu refers to formal magical speech, formulas believed to accomplish effects through utterance. These were not spontaneous prayers, but memorized technical incantations. Speaking the correct words in the correct sequence was essential. Enki supervised this incantation, present with her as she recited. His oversight suggests getting the words exactly right mattered. The text continues. When she had finished her incantation, she pinched off 14 pieces of clay. 7 she placed to the right, 7 she placed to the left. Between them she placed the mould. The word translated mould is libitu, literally brick, specifically the birth. Brick used in Mesopotamian delivery practice. 2 brick-like blocks placed on the ground with space between them, over which a woman would squat during labour. Nintu arranges the 14 clay pieces in birth configuration, 7 on each side, as if preparing for multiple simultaneous deliveries. The text treats this as actual birth procedure. But 14 pieces of clay don't immediately become humans. The text indicates a waiting period, a gestation. The wise and learned goddesses came, 7 and 7. 7 brought forth males, 7 brought forth females. Wise and learned goddesses suggests assistants, experienced female deities who help with birthing. Each assistant appears responsible for one piece, supervising its transformation. The phrase brought forth is the standard verb for giving birth. These goddesses are not creating through abstract divine power, but delivering through birth process. Finally, creation succeeds. The forms of people Nintu made. The Enki and Ninmah version provides similar procedural details with variations. After initial successful creation, Ninmah challenges Enki to a contest. She creates 6 humans with various defects. 1 who cannot hold urine, 1 who is barren, 1 neither male nor female, and 3 others with impairments. For each defective human, Enki assigns a social role that accommodates the limitation. Then Enki creates a being so damaged that even Ninmah cannot accommodate it. A human who is senile, decrepit, unable to function. Ninmah becomes frustrated and throws down her clay. The creature you made, its existence is not good or bad, it cannot come close to being a person. This entire contest section reads like engineering documentation, successful standard procedure, followed by variations and modifications, some producing manageable results, others producing failures. The creation procedure, as described across texts, involves multiple components, proper timing, and ritual preparation, specially selected materials prepared through purification, precise mixing by knowledgeable practitioners, spoken incantations accompanying physical actions, birth configuration arrangement, supervised gestation, and eventual emergence of living beings. Failed variations result from improper procedure or careless execution. This is not the language of pure mythology. Mythology explains origins through cosmic conflict, divine will, or spontaneous emergence. It doesn't typically specify materials, describe mixing processes, detail birth configurations, acknowledge failures, or present creation as requiring specialized technical knowledge. The Sumerian texts describe creation as biological engineering, taking existing materials, combining them properly, allowing development under supervision and producing designed organisms with specific capabilities. One could argue that all creation myths implicitly involve biological engineering. But most creation myths don't describe the process. They state the result: the gods made humans. The Sumerian texts describe the process in procedural detail: material selection, preparation, combination, configuration, supervision, gestation, delivery. This procedural focus suggests the information was valued for its technical content. Scribes copied these details carefully across centuries because the details themselves mattered. Getting the sequence right, specifying exact materials, naming supervising deities, describing birth configuration. All this was considered important information worth preserving accurately. Why would scribes preserve such technical details unless they believed the details described something real? If creation accounts are purely symbolic theology, why maintain such specificity? Symbolic narratives can drift and elaborate freely because exact details don't matter. But if creation accounts preserve historical memory, even partially accurate, even filtered through limited understanding, then preserving details matters. Future generations might understand better, might recognize significance current generations miss. Maintaining accuracy ensures that when understanding advances, the records remain useful. The Sumerian scribes maintained these creation accounts with careful accuracy across more than 1,000 years. They specified materials, named participants, described procedures, acknowledged failures. They treated creation as documented event rather than theological abstraction. Something happened in the Abzu according to Sumerian records. Enki and Ninmah performed procedures using clay and divine essence. They mixed, shaped, incanted, and gestated. They experimented and corrected. They produced beings designed to bear divine labor, beings called humans, created deliberately, engineered for function, limited in specific ways, but granted capabilities matching their purposes. The tablets preserve these procedural details because the details were considered facts worth knowing, history worth transmitting, technical information worth maintaining. The clay and blood mixed in the Abzu. The incantations were spoken. The birth brick was positioned. The gestation occurred. And humanity emerged, made, not born from nature, designed, not randomly evolved, created for purpose, not existing as cosmic inevitability. The question that haunts these texts is whether the Sumerians were inventing origin stories or documenting, however imperfectly, procedures they believed had actually occurred, biological modifications they thought had actually taken place. The procedural specificity suggests documentation. The careful preservation suggests valued information. The consistency across sources suggests established tradition maintained deliberately. The texts read like records, like technical documentation, like attempts to capture processes that witnesses wanted future generations to understand. Whether those future generations include us, reading these texts 4,000 years later with vastly different frameworks, that is the question we continue to explore. Clay and crimson. The materials matter. In the Sumerian creation accounts, humanity does not emerge from nothing. Two specific substances combine to produce human life: clay from the earth and blood from divine beings. The texts emphasize these materials repeatedly as essential components without which creation cannot occur. Begin with clay. The Sumerian word is im, the Akkadian da, both referring to the wet earth of the alluvial plain, the mud that could be shaped into bricks for building, formed into tablets for writing, moulded into pottery for storage. This was the most common material in Mesopotamia, available everywhere. In economic texts, scribes inventory clay for construction projects. In technical texts, they describe proper clay preparation for different purposes. The word im, or g, in these practical contexts means actual physical earth. When creation texts specify that Ningtu uses clay to form humans, the same word appears. The text doesn't use a different term, suggesting metaphorical earth. It uses the everyday word for the material that forms mud bricks and cuneiform tablets. The implication is that Nintu is working with actual physical clay. This creates interesting interpretive possibilities. If clay symbolizes earthly matter or physical materiality, then using clay to create humans might represent the earthly, physical nature of human existence. This symbolic reading has theological merit, but the texts don't frame clay symbolically. They present it as an ingredient, a required material that must be obtained, prepared properly, and mixed with other components. Nintu shapes this clay, positions it in birth configuration, supervises its transformation into living flesh. The transformation from clay to flesh requires explanation. The texts don't provide explicitly. Clay remains inert. Something must transform it. That transformation agent, according to the texts, is divine blood. The Akkadian word damu and its Sumerian equivalent mean blood, the red liquid that flows in veins, that spills from wounds, that is offered in sacrifice. This is blood in the most literal sense, the same word used throughout cuneiform medical texts describing blood loss, bloodletting therapies, menstrual blood, and sacrificial blood. But the texts also use related terms, suggesting more than simple blood. The Akkadian, mu, appears repeatedly. Intelligence, reason, understanding, the divine essence that makes conscious thought possible. When Atrahasis specifies that Elu, who possesses mu, is slaughtered for creation, the text indicates his blood carries this rational essence. The phrase flesh and blood appears in some passages, suggesting that solid tissue and liquid blood together comprise the required divine material. Nintu mixes clay not just with liquid blood, but with flesh and blood, the complete biological substance of the slaughtered god. This raises profound questions about what the texts describe. In modern understanding, biological tissue contains DNA genetic information encoded in molecules that specify how organisms develop and function. Every cell holds complete genetic instructions. If a scientifically advanced entity wanted to modify the genetic makeup of primitive hominids, they would need to introduce new genetic information. Theoretically, this could be done by extracting DNA from donor organisms and inserting it into the target organism's genome. From the perspective of Bronze Age observers who witness such procedures but lack scientific vocabulary, what would they see and how would they explain it? They would see beings extracting blood and tissue from one source, mixing it with earth materials, and producing new beings different from what existed before. They would lack terms for DNA or genetic modification. They would describe what they saw using available vocabulary, clay and blood, mixing and forming. This interpretation that Sumerian creation accounts preserve garbled memories of genetic engineering is speculative and controversial. Mainstream scholarship strongly rejects it as reading modern science anachronistically into ancient mythology. The consensus view holds that clay represents human mortality and earthly nature, while divine blood represents the spark of life or consciousness. The mixture symbolizes humanity's dual nature. This symbolic interpretation is certainly possible and may be correct, but it requires imposing meanings on the texts rather than taking them at face value. The texts themselves don't explain that clay symbolizes mortality or blood symbolizes consciousness. They present clay and blood as required ingredients. Moreover, the specificity about which God's blood is used suggests more than generic symbolism. Elu Geshtu, is selected specifically because he possesses Shimu, rationality. This God's blood is required because it carries the quality humans will need. If blood is merely symbolic of life in general, why specify that the particular god slaughtered must possess intelligence? The selection logic implies that blood carries specific properties from its source. Use intelligent god's blood, produce intelligent humans. This is sympathetic magic. Thinking properties of materials transfer to products made from them, but is also consistent with genetic thinking. Use DNA from intelligent organisms to modify less intelligent organisms. The Enuma Elish adds another detail. The god whose blood is used is Chingu. Tiamat's general who led armies and wore the Tablet of Destinies. His blood carries not just intelligence but leadership capacity, strategic thinking. Use his blood and humans inherit these qualities. We become intelligent, strategic, ambitious. Different texts specify different gods as blood source, but all specify gods with relevant attributes. The pattern suggests blood selection matters, that different sources produce different results. The mixing process receives emphasis across texts. The verb balalu indicates thorough combination, not merely placing materials side by side. Nintu must work clay and blood together until they form unified substance. Modern genetic engineering involves inserting genetic sequences into host DNA, such that the modified genome functions as coherent whole. This is mixing at molecular level, combining genetic material from different sources to create organisms with hybrid characteristics. If the Sumerian texts preserve memories of such procedures, mixing clay and blood might describe combining DNA of primitive earthly hominids, clay, with genetic material from more advanced beings, divine blood. The result would be humans, biologically related to Earth-evolved organisms, but carrying genetic modifications from external source. This interpretation explains several puzzling features. It explains why both materials are absolutely required. Neither alone suffices. Pure clay remains lifeless. Pure divine blood without earthly substrate cannot form physical bodies. The combination produces beings with attributes of both sources. It explains emphasis on mixing procedure, getting proportions right, combining thoroughly, following correct sequence. Genetic modification requires precision. It explains the gestation period. Genetic modifications require time for altered DNA to direct development. This transformation takes time, just as embryonic development takes time. It explains failed prototypes. Genetic engineering involves trial and error. Not all modifications produce viable organisms. Successful modification requires multiple attempts. It explains design limitations. Humans receive specific capabilities matching intended function, but other capacities are withheld. We get intelligence sufficient for complex labour, but not full intelligence of our creators. We get lifespan sufficient for productivity, but not divine immortality. But this genetic engineering interpretation faces significant challenges. First, it requires that scientifically advanced beings existed in prehistoric times. No archaeological evidence supports advanced technological civilizations in Mesopotamia before Sumerian emergence around 3500 BCE. Second, it requires these advanced beings were witnessed by humans who passed down memories that Sumerians later recorded. This transmission across potentially thousands of years seems implausible. Third, it requires genetic modification of hominids produced modern humans, that Homo sapiens resulted from engineering rather than evolution. This contradicts overwhelming genetic, fossil, and archaeological evidence supporting evolutionary origin. Modern human DNA shows clear evolutionary relationship to other primates. Fourth, it assumes advanced beings would operate through procedures visible to primitive observers, killing donors, extracting blood, mixing with materials. Actual genetic engineering operates at microscopic molecular level, invisible without sophisticated instruments. These challenges seriously undermine the genetic engineering interpretation. Mainstream scholarship is correct to reject it as speculative and unsupported. The symbolic interpretation, clay, represents earthly mortality, blood represents divine life force, makes far fewer problematic assumptions. Yet the symbolic interpretation also struggles to explain certain textual features. Why such emphasis on procedure? Why failed experiments? Why specified gods with particular attributes? Why gestation periods? A third possibility merits consideration. The texts might preserve partial memories of sophisticated biological knowledge possessed by early Sumerians or their predecessors. knowledge not of genetic engineering but of selective breeding, hybrid production, or biological manipulation within Bronze Age technological limits. Humans have practiced selective breeding for thousands of years, choosing animals or plants with desired traits and breeding them to concentrate those traits. This requires no advanced technology, just observation and patience. Mesopotamians bred sheep for better wool, cattle for larger size. Perhaps the creation accounts preserve memory of applying similar principles to human biology, not creating humans from scratch, but modifying existing human populations to enhance certain capabilities. Clay might represent base human population, divine blood, might represent genetic contribution from superior individuals, and mixing might represent controlled breeding programs. This interpretation is less dramatic than genetic engineering by aliens, but more plausible than pure symbolic mythology. It suggests the Sumerians possessed sophisticated biological knowledge and applied it to human enhancement. Evidence for such programs would be difficult to detect archaeologically. Selective breeding operates gradually over generations. Modified humans would remain biologically human. Oral traditions might preserve memories of intentional modification as stories of gods creating humans from clay and blood. But even this moderate interpretation requires assumptions not fully supported by evidence. We have no clear records of systematic human breeding programs in ancient Mesopotamia. The texts don't obviously describe selective breeding, they describe sudden creation of new beings. The materials remain ambiguous. Clay and blood combined to create humanity. This is what tablets state across multiple sources spanning a millennium. Whether these materials were literal substances, symbolic representations, or Bronze Age vocabulary describing processes beyond scribes' comprehension remains uncertain. What seems clear is that Sumerian scribes considered these material specifications important enough to preserve accurately. They didn't treat creation as vague mystery, but as documented procedure involving specific ingredients combined properly under expert supervision. Modern interpreters must choose how to weight this testimony. We can dismiss it as mythology, we can interpret it symbolically, or we can take it seriously as potential historical memory. Imperfectly preserved accounts of procedures ancient peoples witnessed or inherited knowledge of, but could not fully explain. None of these interpretations can be proven conclusively from texts alone. Each requires assumptions about what kinds of knowledge ancient peoples possessed, but the clay and blood remain, specified repeatedly, emphasized consistently, treated as essential components. Whatever they represent, Sumerian scribes wanted future generations to know that humanity came from mixture, from combination, from taking earthly material and divine essence, and working them together until they became something new. The tablets preserve this information across 4,000 years. The cuneiform marks impressed into clay carry the story forward, and the question persists, what were the Sumerians actually describing? The red and brown combined, the hands shaped, the incantations spoke, and humanity emerged, made from earth, animated by divine essence, designed for purpose, limited by intention, but given enough consciousness to wonder eventually about our own origins. The medical officer of the gods. Among the Sumerian pantheon, Ninmah held unique position. Her name means exalted lady, though she was known by many names. Ninhursag, lady of the sacred mountain, Nintu, lady who gives birth, Bele Ili, lady of the gods. The multiplication of names suggests importance, centrality to theology and cult practice. But more than names, her specific domain defines her significance. Ninmah was the birth goddess, the divine midwife, the deity who presided over pregnancy, labour and delivery. She possessed specialized knowledge of how life begins, how it develops, how it emerges into the world. This knowledge was not automatically available. It was expertise that Ninmah had mastered, making her indispensable when creation required bringing new life into existence. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describing Ninmah emphasize her practical expertise. She knows which herbs strengthen the womb. She understands conception timing. She can determine the sex of an unborn child. She possesses formulas ensuring safe delivery. This is medical knowledge, obstetrical expertise. In the creation accounts, Ninmah functions explicitly as technical specialist. When Enki proposes creating humanity, he requires Ninmah's participation because creation involves birth-giving, and birth-giving falls within her domain. Enki knows how to prepare materials and design procedure. Ninmah knows how to transform those materials into living beings. This specialization is characteristic of Mesopotamian theology. Unlike monotheistic systems where one deity possesses all powers, Mesopotamian polytheism distributed capabilities across multiple beings. Each god had domains where their authority and expertise were paramount. Creation required collaboration between gods with different specializations. Ninmah's role begins after Enki prepares materials. The divine blood has been obtained. The clay is ready. Enki has performed purification rituals. But transforming these materials into living humans requires Ninmah's intervention. The Atrahasis text describes her procedure in medical terms. She mixes materials thoroughly, working them together with professional competence. She recites incantations, memorized sequences that must be spoken correctly. Enki supervises her recitation, ensuring accuracy. Ninmah then divides the prepared mixture into 14 portions. She shapes each portion and arranges 7 pieces on the right side of the birth brick, 7 on the left, establishing the configuration used in actual Mesopotamian childbirth practice. This birth brick detail is particularly significant. The libitu was standard obstetrical equipment. Archaeological excavations have recovered actual birth bricks, sometimes inscribed with protective incantations. Midwives positioned these bricks carefully, creating stable support for labouring women. That Ninmah uses the same equipment in divine creation that human midwives used in ordinary births suggests continuity between divine and human birth processes. The goddess employs her professional tools, follows established procedures, applies the same technical knowledge. The text describes wise and learned goddesses assisting Ninmah, 7 goddesses on each side attending to the clay pieces. The phrase wise and learned indicates these goddesses possess knowledge acquired through training, not innate omniscience. This detail emphasizes the medical framing. Complex procedures require teams of specialists, a chief physician supervising, skilled assistants handling specific tasks, everyone contributing expertise. Each assistant appears responsible for one clay piece, supervising its development through gestation. Eventually, births occur. 7 goddesses deliver male infants, 7 deliver females. The verb used is alid, to give birth. The same verb appearing in birth records and midwifery texts throughout cuneiform literature. The successful outcome. 14 viable humans, 7 breeding pairs, represents Ninmah's professional triumph. She has taken prepared materials and transformed them into living beings through proper application of specialized knowledge. But the Enki and Ninmah text complicates this picture by describing what happens when expert judgment becomes impaired. After successful initial creation, the gods celebrate with a feast. Ninmah and Enki drink beer excessively, becoming intoxicated. In their drunken state, they begin to experiment. Ninmah boasts that she can control human form however she wishes. She creates defective humans to demonstrate this control beings with physical impairments, medical conditions, reproductive failures. The text lists these: a man who cannot control urination, a woman who cannot bear children, a person neither male nor female, and others with disabilities. Each defective creation poses a challenge. What use can be made of a being that cannot fulfill standard human roles? Enki responds by assigning each one to social roles that accommodate their limitations. The incontinent man becomes a court attendant. The barren woman becomes a palace worker. The neither male nor female person becomes a cultic official. These assignments demonstrate Sumerian social accommodation of people with disabilities. but they also reveal something about the creation process itself. Modifications to standard procedure produce variant results. Change the proportions, alter the mixing, skip steps, and you get humans who differ from the design template. Why does Ninmah create these defective humans? The text suggests intoxicated pride. She wants to demonstrate power. But drunkenness impairs judgment. Her professional competence becomes careless experimentation. She loses precision, and precision matters. Proper procedure produces functional humans. Improper procedure produces beings with medical problems. Enki then creates a human so defective that even Ninmah cannot assign it a functional role. A being that is decrepit, broken, barely alive. Ninmah attempts to work with this being, trying to find any capacity it possesses. She fails. This creation is non-functional, complete failure, unusable. Frustrated, Ninmah throws down her clay. The creature you made, its existence is neither good nor bad. It cannot come close to being a person. This moment represents professional despair. The expert midwife confronting a birth so damaged that all her skills cannot remedy it. The contest ends with Enki's victory, but it's hollow. He has demonstrated that even Ninmah's expertise has limits, that procedures can produce results so defective that no intervention helps. Why do the texts preserve this disturbing sequence? Perhaps it explains human disabilities within creation framework. Some people are born with conditions because divine creation sometimes produces variation. Perhaps it encodes medical knowledge about pregnancy. Improper procedures, insufficient care, impaired judgment can produce birth defects. Or perhaps it preserves institutional memory of experimental phases during human creation. Attempts to produce variant humans, some successful enough to accommodate, others complete failures. If texts preserve memories of biological engineering, Ninmah's role becomes even more intriguing. She would represent not mythological birth goddess, but ancient memory of actual medical specialists who performed procedures that modified human biology. The divine midwives might be teams of skilled technicians. The birth brick configuration might represent actual equipment used in procedures that scribes described using familiar obstetrical imagery. The failed creations would document real experimental failures, modifications that didn't produce viable results. Successful engineering typically involves failed prototypes. This interpretation is highly speculative and faces serious challenges. But even symbolic or mythological interpretations must account for why texts describe Ninmah as technical specialist whose expertise is essential, why they specify medical equipment and obstetrical procedures, why they document experimental variations and failures. The simplest explanation is that Ninmah's role reflects real Mesopotamian medical practice. Ancient Mesopotamian midwives were skilled professionals with specialized knowledge passed through apprenticeship. They used specific equipment, followed established procedures, recited therapeutic incantations. Birth was dangerous, requiring expertise to navigate successfully. Projecting this medical reality onto the divine plane, Mesopotamian theology presented creation as requiring similar obstetrical expertise. Ninmah was the cosmic midwife whose knowledge enabled successful birth of humanity. This medical framing has a curious implication. It suggests that even gods don't possess inherent knowledge of all processes. They must develop expertise, master techniques, understand procedures. Ninmah knows birth giving because she has studied and practiced it. This theological model of limited deities with specialized expertise collaborating on complex projects reads remarkably similar to how modern scientific and technical work operates. No single scientist understands all fields. Complex projects require interdisciplinary teams, each contributing specialized knowledge. If Sumerian creation accounts preserve distant memories of actual biological modification, this collaborative structure makes sense. Teams of specialists working together, with obstetrical medical experts handling aspects related to birth and development. Either way, Ninmah emerges as indispensable technical expert, the medical officer of the gods, whose specialized knowledge made human creation possible. Without her participation, Enki's clever procedures would fail. The materials must be transformed into living beings through birth process, and only the birth goddess possesses that knowledge. The clay pieces positioned between birth bricks required expert supervision. The goddesses attending each piece monitored progress, intervened when necessary, ensured successful gestation. Eventually they delivered human infants. 7 boys, 7 girls, the founding population. Ninmah and her team accomplished what was functionally a medical procedure, taking prepared materials and producing living beings through processes analogous to natural birth. The texts frame this as divine achievement, but the language and concepts come from real medical practice. 4,000 years later, we read these texts and wonder, was Ninmah a mythological figure invented to explain birth and creation? Was she theological representation of natural reproductive processes? Or does her name preserve institutional memory of actual medical specialists who performed procedures so advanced that later generations could only explain them as divine acts? The tablets give no definitive answer, but they insist that creation required medical expertise, that birth-giving knowledge was essential, that proper procedure under expert supervision made the difference between success and failure. Ninmah shaped humanity with professional skill, following procedures she had mastered, using equipment she understood, supervising assistants she had trained. The texts honour her expertise, acknowledging that without the birth goddess's specialised knowledge, humanity could not have come into existence. Whether she was myth, memory, or metaphor, the texts preserve her name and function, reminding future generations that we came into being not through abstract divine will alone, but through knowledgeable procedure, expert supervision, and the specialized skills of the cosmic midwife who delivered humanity into existence. The failed prototypes. The contest between Enki and Ninmah, preserved in Enki and Ninmah, contains a section that mainstream scholarship interprets as comic interlude, drunk gods making mistakes, demonstrating both divine power and divine folly. But examine the passage more carefully, and a different pattern emerges. The text describes systematic experimental variation, intentional modifications to standard creation procedure, producing results that diverge from the successful template. This is engineering documentation language, not comedy. After successful creation of the first 14 humans, Ninmah and Enki celebrate with a feast. They drink beer to excess. The text states their hearts became elated, intoxicated. In this impaired state, Ninmah makes a boast. Man's body can be either good or bad, and whether I make a fate good or bad depends on my will. She claims absolute control over human form. This boast sets up the contest. Ninmah will demonstrate her creative control by producing variant humans, and Enki must find uses for whatever she creates. The text then catalogues 6 creations, each with specific defects. First, a man who cannot control his urine. The Sumerian describes his condition matter-of-factly. His bladder doesn't function properly, he cannot retain urine, he suffers from incontinence. This is medical condition, not moral failing. Second, a woman who cannot bear children. The term indicates barrenness, infertility. Her reproductive system doesn't function as designed. Third, a being who is neither male nor female. The Sumerian term is ambiguous, possibly indicating physical intersex conditions, gender ambiguity, or other variations from binary sexual development. Fourth, fifth, and sixth creations receive less detailed description, but appear to involve other physical or mental impairments. For each creation, Enki responds by assigning social roles that accommodate limitations. The incontinent man becomes a court attendant, where his condition can be managed. The barren woman becomes a palace worker where childlessness is acceptable. The neither male nor female person becomes a cultic official where gender ambiguity serves ritual purposes. These assignments demonstrate sophisticated social accommodation. But they also reveal something about creation itself. Each variant results from modifying standard procedure. Change something about the mixture, the shaping, the incantation, and you get humans who differ from the template. Consider this from engineering perspective. When developing new technology, engineers establish standard design that reliably produces desired results. Then they experiment with variations, adjusting parameters, modifying components, testing alternatives, to explore the design space. Some variations improve performance in certain contexts. Others produce failures that must be discarded. Ninma's experimental creations read exactly like this engineering exploration. She modifies standard procedure and observes results. Most variants are viable but impaired compared to template. They can survive and function, but with limitations that prevent optimal performance. Why would mythology include such content? What theological purpose does cataloguing failed prototypes serve? If the point is simply to explain that gods created humans, why describe experimental variations? One possibility is that this section legitimized social roles for people with disabilities. By showing that even variant creations from imperfect divine procedures could find useful positions, the text validated inclusion of disabled individuals. This is plausible and socially progressive. Another possibility is that the text preserved medical knowledge about birth defects and developmental variations. Midwives regularly encountered children born with impairments. Explaining these conditions as resulting from variant divine procedures made them comprehensible within theological frameworks. But a third possibility is that the text preserved institutional memory of actual experimental phases during human biological modification. If humanity resulted from deliberate engineering, then development presumably involved trial and error. Attempts to produce humans with specific capabilities, some attempts succeeding better than others. Modern genetic engineering involves exactly such experimental phases. Scientists attempting to modify organisms test various genetic modifications, observe results, adjust parameters, and iterate toward desired outcomes. Many attempts produce organisms that survive but have unintended side effects or limitations. If Sumerian texts preserve memories of genetic modification, Ninma's experimental creations document the failed prototype phase, variants that were produced during development but didn't meet design specifications for optimal human workers. This interpretation is highly speculative and lacks supporting evidence. But it explains features that are otherwise puzzling. Why describe specific impairments in technical detail? Why emphasize that variations result from modified procedures? Why frame this as experimental exploration rather than random error? The contest continues with Enki creating a human so damaged that Ninma cannot accommodate it. The text describes this being as utterly non-functional, unable to eat, unable to move properly, unable to communicate, unable to perform any useful activity. This is complete failure. A creation so defective that it cannot be salvaged. Ninma examines this being carefully, trying different approaches, attempting to find any capacity it possesses. She fails. The being cannot function in any context. The man you have made, neither good nor bad is his condition. It is not even close to being human. This final creation crossed the threshold from impaired but viable into non-viable. It represents the boundary between acceptable variation and complete failure. In engineering terms, this is the design space limit. Beyond this point, modifications produce non-functional results that must be discarded. Why does Enki create this failure? The text frames it as competition, demonstrating that even Ninma's expertise has limits. But the dramatic function is educational. It establishes where boundaries lie, showing the difference between manageable impairment and total failure. The contest ends with Ninma's acknowledgement of defeat. She has demonstrated that variant humans can be created and accommodated, but she has also confronted limits. Some creations fail so completely that even expert intervention cannot rescue them. Across this entire section, one theme remains constant: procedure matters. Standard creation process produces functional humans. Modifications produce variants. Careful modifications produce manageable variants. Careless or excessive modifications produce failures. Proper procedure, executed competently, is essential. This procedural emphasis is not typical of mythology. Myths focus on cosmic events, divine personalities, moral lessons, theological truths. They don't typically dwell on technical procedures, experimental variations, and the difference between competent and incompetent execution. Why? The simplest explanation is that whoever originated these accounts valued procedural accuracy. They were documenting processes they believed actually occurred, and getting procedural details right mattered. This sounds absurd if we assume the texts are pure mythology. No one needs to know exact procedure for divine human creation, if gods will never again create humans, and humans cannot replicate divine procedures. But if texts preserve institutional memory of actual biological modification, documenting procedures makes complete sense. The knowledge is valuable. Future generations with sufficient advancement might understand procedures better, might replicate or improve them, might learn from documented successes and failures. This interpretation requires accepting unlikely propositions. That biological modification of humans occurred in prehistoric times, that memory survived through oral tradition into written texts, that scribes accurately maintained those memories across centuries. Each proposition faces serious challenges. Yet the alternative, that purely mythological texts repeatedly emphasize procedural details, experimental variations, and technical specifications for no functional reason, also strains credulity. The failed prototype section accomplishes several things simultaneously. It explains human variation and disability. It validates social accommodation of impaired individuals. It demonstrates both divine power and divine limitation. And it documents experimental phases of human creation, preserving knowledge about what variations are possible, which are viable, and where boundaries of success and failure lie. Whether those documented experiments represent mythological narrative, symbolic theology, or institutional memory of actual biological modification remains ambiguous. But the Sumerian scribes who maintained these texts believed they were preserving important technical information about how humanity came to be. The clay pieces shaped carelessly produced beings who couldn't function properly. The procedures executed incompetently led to failures that couldn't be remedied. But the successful template, when followed correctly by competent practitioners, reliably produced functional human beings capable of bearing divine labour, reproducing their kind, sustaining themselves, and fulfilling the purposes for which they were designed. The tablets preserve this record successes and failures, competent and careless procedures, viable and non-viable results. They document exactly what we would expect from engineering records, the full history of development, including experimental phases, failed prototypes, and eventual successful design. Whether the tablets document divine mythology or prehistoric science, one conclusion seems inescapable. The Sumerian scribes believed they were preserving important technical information. The details mattered. The failures mattered. The procedural specifications mattered. And maintaining accurate records across centuries mattered enough that scribes carefully copied these texts generation after generation. We are those future generations reading texts copied carefully across 4 millennia. The failed prototypes, documented by ancient scribes, remain preserved in cuneiform clay. And the question persists, why did Bronze Age Sumerians consider it important to record not just that humans were created, but how, including the experimental failures, the procedural variations, and the boundaries between success and catastrophic failure? Adapa and the incomplete design. The myth of Adapa survives in fragmentary form across several tablets, primarily in the British Museum. Catalogue numbers K8743 and K8214 preserve portions of the Akkadian version. Additional fragments were discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, indicating the story's wide circulation. Adapa holds unique status in Mesopotamian literature. He is described as the first of the 7 antediluvian sages, the Apkallu who brought civilized knowledge to humanity before the flood. But he is also described as created by Enki specifically as a model human, a prototype demonstrating what humans could be. The text begins by establishing Adapa's exceptional nature. He was wise, his command like that of the god Ea Enki. Wide understanding he perfected for him to disclose the design of the land. To him he gave wisdom, eternal life he did not give him. This opening establishes the central paradox. Adapa possesses wisdom comparable to divine intelligence, but he lacks immortality. He has one divine attribute, but not another. This selective granting suggests intentional design, deliberate choices about which attributes to include and which to withhold. Adapa was the sage, the man of Eridu, created to be a model of men. He served as priest, performing rituals and maintaining cultic obligations. He possessed extraordinary knowledge, broad understanding and wisdom that allowed him to comprehend and manage complex affairs. But something crucial was withheld. Despite receiving divine wisdom, Adapa did not receive eternal life. Adapa was designed to be mortal, to age and die, despite possessing intelligence rivaling the gods. Why this selective limitation? The narrative that follows demonstrates consequences. Adapa's wisdom and mortality interact in ways that reveal the deliberate nature of his design. The myth's central episode involves Adapa fishing in the Persian Gulf when the south wind capsizes his boat. Enraged, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind, using physical force or magical power to stop the wind from blowing. The south wind's wing remains broken for 7 days. This disruption troubles the supreme god Anu, who resides in heaven. He inquires who broke the south wind and learns that Adapa was responsible. Anu summons Adapa to heaven to explain and face judgment. Enki, Adapa's creator and protector, learns of the summons and advises Adapa how to behave. He warns Adapa that Anu will offer him the bread of death and water of death, and Adapa must refuse both or he will die. Enki instructs Adapa to accept no food or drink offered by Anu. Adapa travels to heaven and appears before Anu. He follows Enki's instructions carefully. 2 gods intercede on his behalf, speaking favourably, explaining his situation sympathetically. Anu is moved by these appeals. Rather than punishing Adapa, Anu recognizes his exceptional nature. He observes that Adapa possesses wisdom like the gods but lacks immortality. In a moment of divine generosity, Anu decides to remedy this. He will grant Adapa eternal life. Anu orders his attendants, bring him the bread of life, that he may eat it. The attendants bring bread of life and water of life, not death, as Enki warned, but life. These are substances that grant immortality. But Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refuses. He will not eat the bread. He will not drink the water. The text records Anu's shocked response. Why, Adapa, did you not eat? Did you not drink? You will not have eternal life. Ah, foolish mankind. Adapa has been offered immortality and refused it through obedience to instructions that proved false. Enki told him the offerings would be death, they were actually life. Enki's deception, or perhaps his limited knowledge of Anu's decision, has cost Adapa eternal life. Anu sends Adapa back to earth, mortal as before, despite possessing divine wisdom. This narrative has generated extensive scholarly interpretation. Most recognize it as Mesopotamia's version of the fall of man, explaining why humans are mortal despite possessing intelligence that suggests we might deserve immortality. But examine the narrative through the lens of deliberate design, and additional patterns emerge. Adapa was created by Enki specifically as a model human. Enki gave Adapa wisdom deliberately. This was conscious design decision. But Enki did not give Adapa eternal life. This too was deliberate choice. When Anu later offers to correct this deficiency by granting Adapa immortality, Enki intervenes to prevent it. His false warning ensures Adapa refuses the offer. Enki apparently wants Adapa to remain mortal despite possessing divine wisdom. Why would Adapa's creator design him as intentionally mortal, but then deceive him to ensure he remains mortal when another god offers to change that design? Several interpretations suggest themselves. Perhaps humans are supposed to be mortal, and granting even one human immortality would violate proper boundaries between divine and human realms. Enki preserves cosmic order by ensuring Adapa remains within human limitations. Perhaps immortal humans with divine wisdom would become dangerous, challenging divine authority. Keeping humans mortal maintains divine supremacy even when humans possess intelligence. Perhaps immortal humans who reproduce would eventually overwhelm available resources. Mortality limits population through death even as reproduction increases it. Perhaps Adapa was created as a test case, exploring what happens when humans receive substantial intelligence without immortality. Enki designed this combination deliberately to observe results, and preserving the design against later modification serves research purposes. Any of these interpretations could explain Enki's actions, but all share a common assumption. Adapa's combination of attributes, high intelligence plus mortality, was deliberately designed, not accidental. His nature reflects conscious decisions about human capabilities and limitations. The text explicitly states that Enki gave wisdom to Adapa, but did not give eternal life. These are active verbs indicating deliberate choices. Adapa's attributes were selected, not inevitable. He could have been made differently. The fact that he received one attribute but not the other indicates intentional design specifications. This designed limitation theme appears throughout Mesopotamian human creation accounts. The Atrahasis epic mentions that gods eventually limit human lifespan through disease and infant mortality because humanity's excessive reproduction threatens divine peace. The texts present human mortality not as cosmic necessity but as imposed limitation serving functional purposes. Similarly, human intelligence is granted in measured amounts, enough to perform labour and understand instruction, but perhaps not equal to divine intelligence. Adapa is exceptional, receiving more wisdom than normal humans. Standard humans have more limited intelligence, appropriate to their function as workers. The Gilgamesh epic includes a parallel narrative, the creation of Enkidu, who begins as wild man living with animals, possessing physical strength but lacking human consciousness. The temple priestess civilizes Enkidu through sexual intimacy and companionship. He loses connection with animals, but gains human intelligence and social integration. This transformation describes another aspect of human design. Consciousness and civilization are not original natural states, but developments that must be induced. Enkidu's creation follows similar procedural patterns to humanity's general creation. The goddess Aruru forms him from clay in the wild. He exists initially as purely physical being, strong, capable, but not conscious in fully human sense. Only after the priestess's intervention does he become fully human. This two-stage development, physical creation, followed by consciousness activation, suggests that intelligence or awareness is not automatic, but requires specific intervention. Adapa's case makes this explicit. Enki gave wisdom to Adapa through deliberate action. The wisdom was not inherent but granted, added, installed. If these texts preserve memories of biological modification, this two-stage process might describe actual procedures, first producing physical organisms with human-like bodies, then implementing cognitive modifications that grant enhanced intelligence. The selective granting of attributes becomes particularly intriguing from this perspective. Creating beings requires choosing what capabilities to include. Make them strong enough for hard labour, but not so strong they can rebel effectively. Make them intelligent enough to understand complex instructions, but not so intelligent they question authority. Make them reproductive so they multiply and replace losses, but mortal so populations don't grow uncontrollably. Adapa represents the upper boundary of intended human capability, divine level intelligence combined with standard mortality. His story demonstrates both the possibility and the danger of this combination. Give humans too much wisdom and they approach divine status. Anu recognizes this when he offers to complete Adapa's deification by adding immortality. But Enki prevents it, maintaining the design boundaries. The text thus documents limits of human potential within designed parameters. We can achieve high intelligence. Adapa proves this possible. But we remain mortal regardless of intellectual achievement. The two attributes are independently controlled. This separability of attributes, intelligence versus immortality, suggests modular design. Different capabilities are controlled independently and can be granted or withheld separately. Adapa gets wisdom but not eternal life. Standard humans get less wisdom and similar mortality. Gods have both attributes fully. The system allows mixing and matching attributes to produce beings with specific capability profiles. Modern genetic engineering operates similarly. Different genes control different traits, allowing modifications to target specific capabilities without necessarily affecting others. But again, this interpretation requires accepting that the texts preserve memories of genetic engineering rather than pure mythology. Mainstream scholarship rejects this reading as unsupported speculation. Both interpretations can accommodate the textual evidence. But the symbolic reading struggles to explain why the texts emphasize the deliberate, chosen nature of Adapa's design. Mythology could simply state that humans are intelligent but mortal. Instead, the text specifies that Enki deliberately gave wisdom, deliberately withheld immortality, and then deliberately deceived Adapa to prevent another god from altering that design. This emphasis on deliberate choice, intentional design, and maintained specifications reads more like engineering documentation than symbolic theology. Adapa's story thus becomes part of a larger pattern across Sumerian creation. Accounts, humanity was designed with specific capabilities and limitations serving functional purposes. We were not created with maximum possible attributes, but with carefully calibrated characteristics matching our intended role. The wisdom Enki gave Adapa included knowledge of civilized arts, how to organize society, perform rituals, manage affairs, transmit learning. This knowledge became foundational for human civilization. But the immortality Enki withheld ensured that even the wisest humans remain mortal, that knowledge must be transmitted across generations through teaching rather than being held indefinitely by immortal individuals. This design produces a specific result: civilized, intelligent, capable beings who nonetheless remain subordinate to gods, dependent on divine goodwill, limited in ways that prevent challenge to cosmic hierarchy. We are smart enough to be useful, mortal enough to remain controlled, conscious enough to understand our condition, but not powerful enough to change it fundamentally. Adapa's story explains this combination as deliberate. The gods chose to make us this way. We are incomplete by design, granted some attributes but denied others, carefully calibrated to fulfill functions without exceeding boundaries. Whether this represents mythology explaining human nature or institutional memory documenting actual biological modification, one conclusion seems clear. The Sumerian scribes who maintained Adapa's story believed that human capabilities and limitations result from conscious design decisions, not cosmic accident or natural inevitability. We are what we were made to be: intelligent but mortal, capable but limited, wise enough to wonder about our origins, but perhaps not given enough wisdom to fully comprehend them. The King List and Genetic Longevity. The Weld Blundell prism stands 20 centimetres tall in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Its four sides contain dense cuneiform inscription, the Sumerian King List, dated to approximately 1800 BCE. The list begins with a theological statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then enumerates kings who ruled various Sumerian cities from earliest times through the end of the Isin dynasty. But the opening section, the antediluvian rulers who reigned before the Great Flood, contains numbers that defy easy interpretation. The first king listed is Alulim, who ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. The second king, Al-Aljar, also of Eridu, ruled 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibira, ruled 40,200 years. The list continues through 8 antediluvian kings, totaling 200 years. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, the king list resumes with post-diluvian dynasties, but now the numbers change dramatically. The kings of Kish reign for decades or centuries rather than tens of thousands of years. By the time the list reaches kings whose reigns can be verified through contemporary inscriptions, the reign lengths are realistic, decades, not millennia. How should we understand kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years? Scholarly consensus interprets these numbers as symbolic or mythological rather than literal historical data. Various theories explain the extraordinary figures. They might represent institutional continuity rather than individual lifespans. A king is actually a dynasty. They might use different temporal units than years, perhaps months or seasons. They might employ symbolic numerology, encoding cosmic patterns through mathematical relationships. They might simply be legendary exaggeration. Ancient peoples attributing impossible longevity to primeval kings to elevate their status. All these interpretations have scholarly support. They make antediluvian reign lengths comprehensible within frameworks of how ancient texts function. But these interpretations share a common assumption: the numbers cannot be literally true. No human lived 2,800 years. Therefore, the text must mean something other than what it literally states. Yet the king list doesn't present itself as symbolic or metaphorical. It uses the same format, grammatical structures, organizational principles throughout, antediluvian and post-diluvian sections alike. The list treats Alulim, who ruled 28,800 years before the flood, with the same matter-of-fact presentation as later kings with realistic brief reigns. The text gives no indication that readers should interpret the two sections differently. It presents unified chronology from primeval past through historical present, as if the compiler believed the entire sequence represented actual history. This creates an interpretive problem. Either the Sumerians believed their antediluvian kings literally lived tens of thousands of years, which seems absurd, or they were using numbers symbolically while presenting them as historical, which seems deceptive, or they were preserving traditions they inherited without fully understanding them. A fourth possibility merits consideration. What if the numbers preserve garbled but genuine information about dramatic biological differences between pre-flood and post-flood populations? If the creation accounts preserve memories of biological modification, humans deliberately designed with specific capabilities, then presumably designers could have granted longer lifespans if desired. The Adapa myth states explicitly that Enki withheld eternal life despite giving divine wisdom. This suggests longevity was an adjustable parameter. Perhaps early humans, the first generations after creation, were designed with dramatically extended lifespans. The antediluvian kings living tens of thousands of years would represent original human design, programmed for extreme longevity. After the flood, human lifespans were limited either through deliberate reduction or through genetic dilution. This interpretation faces obvious challenges. Modern human biology shows no evidence of programming for extreme longevity. Our bodies age through accumulated cellular damage, telomere shortening, protein misfolding. We seem built for lifespans of decades, not tens of thousands of years. Moreover, populations living tens of thousands of years would produce unsustainable population growth. 8 antediluvian kings ruling 240 years represent extraordinary demographic stability. Yet consider the pattern. The king list shows progressive reduction in lifespan from antediluvian through early post-diluvian to historically verified periods. The trend is clear: earlier, longer lived, later shorter lived, with continuous reduction until lifespans stabilize at biologically realistic levels. One could interpret this as natural mythological exaggeration. But one could also interpret it as demographic record of actual longevity reduction. Early populations genuinely lived far longer. Later populations experienced progressive lifespan limitation until biology stabilized at current parameters. If humanity was biologically engineered with extended lifespan programming, subsequent populations might lose that programming through genetic drift, accumulated mutations, or deliberate limitation. The king list would then document this transition. The flood marks the boundary between dramatically different biological regimes. Before flood, extreme longevity. After flood, progressive reduction, approaching realistic human lifespans within several generations. The flood itself might have been the mechanism of transition, either catastrophe that reduced population to small groups carrying only partial longevity programming, or deliberate intervention limiting human lifespans for population control. The Atrahasis epic supports this interpretation. That text describes gods becoming disturbed by human overpopulation and excessive noise. Enlil attempts various solutions before deciding on the flood. But even after the flood, gods implement measures to control human population, including limiting lifespans and introducing infant mortality. If pre-flood populations also enjoyed dramatically extended lifespans, they would reproduce prodigiously. Even modest reproductive rates would produce explosive population growth. The gods' concern about human overpopulation would be justified if early humans were effectively immortal while remaining fertile. Limiting post-flood human lifespans to centuries, then decades, provides automatic population control. Reduce each generation's reproductive window from thousands of years to decades, and population growth becomes manageable. The king list's numbers might thus preserve memory of this transition from populations programmed for extreme longevity to populations with progressively limited lifespans to populations with modern biological constraints. But, again, this interpretation requires accepting that human biology was deliberately programmed, that original programming included extreme longevity, and that subsequent modifications reduced lifespans. None of these propositions have supporting biological evidence. Alternative symbolic interpretations remain more plausible. The antediluvian numbers might represent institutional continuity, calendrical symbolism, or mythological emphasis on primeval difference. The reduction pattern might reflect universal mythological tendency to place golden ages in distant past. Yet the king list maintains such specific numbers, not round symbolic figures but precise values like 28,800 or 40,200 years. These numbers relate mathematically, forming patterns that some scholars interpret as based on astronomical cycles or sexagesimal, base 60 mathematics the Mesopotamians used. If numbers are symbolic or astronomical, they might encode cosmic cycles rather than historical duration, but they might also encode both, using astronomical period as timing mechanism while genuinely recording that individuals ruled through multiple cycles. What remains undeniable is that the king list treats antediluvian kings as real historical figures, not obvious myths. It names them individually, specifies their cities, records their reigns with numerical precision. The text functions as historical chronicle. The Sumerian scribes who maintained the king list across centuries copied the antediluvian numbers carefully, preserving them accurately alongside historically verified later sections. They transmitted them as factual information future generations would need. Perhaps they were simply being faithful to received traditions without questioning impossible claims. Or perhaps they believed their ancestors genuinely lived dramatically longer, and the numbers, however large, represented real historical memory of different biological conditions. The clay prism sits in Oxford, silent about its compiler's intentions. the cuneiform numbers remain unchanged: 28,800 years, 30,000 years, 40,200 years, defying easy explanation. Whether the antediluvian rain lengths represent symbol, error, or memory, they testify to Sumerian belief that earliest times were fundamentally different from later periods. Humanity was different before the flood. Whether symbolically more noble, mythologically more powerful, or literally more long-lived, remains ambiguous. But the pattern of progressive reduction, from extreme to implausible to historically realistic, suggests movement from one biological regime to another, from original design parameters to modified or degraded specifications. The tablets preserve this transition. The numbers document the change. And whether we interpret them as myth, symbol, or garbled memory, they raise the question: why did the Sumerians believe humanity was fundamentally different in primeval times? What mainstream scholarship says: to evaluate any alternative interpretation fairly, we must first understand what consensus academic scholarship says about Sumerian creation texts. Assyriologists have developed sophisticated frameworks for interpreting cuneiform literature through over 150 years of archaeological work, linguistic analysis, and comparative study. The academic consensus holds that Sumerian and Akkadian creation accounts are mythology narratives serving theological, social, and literary purposes within ancient Mesopotamian culture. These texts encode religious beliefs about divine nature, cosmic order, and humanity's place in reality. They explain existential questions in terms comprehensible to Bronze Age peoples lacking scientific frameworks. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent 5 decades working with Sumerian texts at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, established foundations for understanding Sumerian literature as cultural documents reflecting societal values and religious beliefs. His major works: Sumerian Mythology, 1944, History Begins at Sumer, 1956, and the Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, 1963, emphasized that creation myths served etiological purposes, explaining origins of institutions and practices. When Sumerian texts describe gods creating humans to perform labor, they are explaining the divine foundation of human work and justifying social hierarchies where laboring classes support priestly and royal elites. The mythology legitimizes existing social arrangements by presenting them as divinely ordained from creation itself. Thorkild Jacobson approached texts from phenomenological perspective in The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, 1976. Jacobson argued that Mesopotamian peoples experienced divine reality through natural forces: the fertility of fields, the power of storms, the life-giving waters. Gods were not distant abstract beings, but present forces pervading the natural world. In this framework, creation narratives describe how divine forces organized reality from primordial chaos into ordered cosmos. Enki represents the creative intelligence in fresh water that makes agriculture possible. Ninmah represents the generative power of the earth producing life. The mixing of clay and divine blood symbolizes the combination of earthly matter with divine animating spirit that produces conscious living beings. Jacobson read creation texts as sophisticated theological poetry, encoding profound observations about existence, that life emerges from combination of material substance and animating force, that humans occupy an intermediary position between pure matter and pure spirit, that consciousness requires both physical body and something transcendent. Other scholars emphasize mythological parallels across cultures. Nearly all human societies develop creation myths addressing fundamental existential questions. Sumerian creation accounts fit this universal mythological pattern. Comparative mythology reveals that when cultures describe gods creating humans from earth or clay, they are using common symbolic vocabulary. Clay represents mortality, dust to dust. Divine breath or blood represents consciousness or life force. The mixture symbolizes human dual nature as both physical and conscious, mortal yet aware. Modern literary approaches emphasize narrative artistry in creation texts. These are sophisticated compositions displaying literary skill, structured plots, character development, dramatic tension. Reading them merely as failed science or garbled history misses their achievement as literature. Academic consensus also contextualizes text historically. The creation accounts emerged from temple contexts where priests maintained religious traditions. These texts served cultic purposes, recited in rituals, copied as scribal training exercises, preserved as theological reference works. Archaeologically, nothing supports literal reading of creation accounts. Excavations reveal continuous cultural development, not sudden divine creation of civilization. Material culture evolves gradually. The archaeological record shows human cultural evolution, not instantaneous divine bestowal. Biological evidence overwhelmingly supports evolutionary origin for humans. Genetics shows human relationships to other primates through shared DNA. Fossils document transitional forms. Comparative anatomy reveals homologies indicating common descent. No evidence suggests sudden creation through engineering. Given this evidential context, mainstream scholarship correctly concludes that creation narratives are mythology. They encode theological beliefs, not historical or scientific facts. Interpreting them literally contradicts established knowledge from multiple disciplines. This academic consensus deserves serious respect. It represents careful scholarly work by thousands of researchers across generations. The interpretive frameworks emerge from deep engagement with primary sources, sophisticated linguistic knowledge, broad comparative perspective, and integration with archaeological and scientific evidence. Moreover, symbolic mythological interpretation explains most textual features adequately. Why describe clay and blood mixture? Because these symbols effectively represent earthly mortality and divine life combining. Why specify procedures? Because narrative detail makes stories engaging. Why include failed experiments? Because such episodes add interest and explain human variation. Why emphasize specialized divine knowledge? Because this elevates the gods. The mythological interpretation is parsimonious. It requires no extraordinary claims about prehistoric technological civilizations, genetic engineering before scientific knowledge, or preserved memories transmitted accurately across millennia. Scholarly consensus also accounts for variation across sources. Different texts emphasize different aspects because they emerged from different temple traditions or were adapted by different scribal schools. Variations reflect normal mythological development. Furthermore, mainstream interpretation acknowledges genuine sophistication in Sumerian theology without requiring literal historical truth. The texts display profound thinking about human nature, cosmic order, and existential meaning. They deserve respect as sophisticated theological reflection even while recognizing them as mythology. The academic framework accommodates psychological and anthropological insights. Carl Jung's archetypal theory suggests creation. Myths express universal human psychological patterns. Anthropologists note how creation myths function socially, legitimizing power structures, integrating communities, providing meaning frameworks. All these scholarly approaches converge. Creation texts are culturally constructed narratives serving religious, social, psychological, and literary functions. They are not failed science, not garbled history, not primitive error. They are sophisticated cultural productions appropriate to their contexts, deserving study and respect while not being literally true. This consensus interpretation has served scholarship well for over a century. It has enabled productive research generating vast knowledge about ancient Mesopotamian civilization. It represents the best scholarly judgment about how to understand these texts responsibly. Yet consensus interpretations, however well established, can sometimes become overly restrictive. Foreclosing questions, dismissing possibilities, or assuming frameworks exhaust all legitimate approaches. While mainstream scholarship is overwhelmingly correct in rejecting fringe theories about ancient aliens or Atlantean superscience, legitimate questions remain about whether conventional mythological interpretation fully accounts for all textual features. The procedural specificity, consistency across sources, emphasis on material components, acknowledgement of failures, and framing as institutional documentation still seem somewhat unusual for pure mythology. These features don't invalidate mythological interpretation, but suggest the texts might encode information beyond what conventional frameworks accommodate. Perhaps the Sumerians were recording the closest approximation they could manage of processes they had witnessed or inherited knowledge of but could not fully explain. Perhaps their mythological framework served not to invent fiction but to explain actual procedures using available conceptual vocabulary. This possibility, that myth might preserve garbled memory alongside and within symbolic meaning, does not require rejecting mainstream scholarship, but does require holding mythological interpretation somewhat tentatively, acknowledging it may not exhaust all that texts contain. The tablets sit in museums worldwide. Academic consensus interprets them as mythology serving theological purposes. Alternative theories suggest they might preserve technical memories despite mythological framing. Both perspectives have merit. Both face challenges. Neither definitively proves its interpretation beyond doubt. What remains certain is that ancient scribes maintained these texts carefully across centuries, believing they contained important information worth preserving accurately. Whether that information was primarily theological or potentially historical, mythological or memorial, symbolic or partially technical, this remains perhaps genuinely undecided. The question that remains. The basement archive is cool and quiet. The clay tablet that began this investigation, CBS 10673 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, sits in its storage location, one artifact among thousands, 20 centimeters tall, 260 lines of Sumerian cuneiform impressed into wet clay approximately 4,000 years ago. The tablet is broken. Roughly half survives. But what remains describes the creation of humanity with procedural specificity unusual for texts typically interpreted as pure mythology. Over many hours we have examined this tablet and others like it, scattered across museum collections worldwide. We have translated the Sumerian and Akkadian words, traced archaeological contexts, identified scholarly frameworks, and explored alternative possibilities about what these ancient records might preserve. What have we learned? The Sumerian texts describing human creation maintain remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources, spanning more than 1,000 years. They specify materials, clay, and divine blood. They identify specialized deities, Enki and Ninmah, whose particular expertise enables creation. They describe procedures, mixing, shaping, birth configuration, gestation. They acknowledge failures, experimental variations producing defective results. They document limitations, design boundaries on human capabilities, particularly withholding immortality despite granting intelligence. Mainstream scholarly consensus interprets these texts as sophisticated mythology serving theological, social, and literary purposes. This interpretation has substantial merit. It aligns with how scholars understand mythology globally. It requires no extraordinary claims. It explains texts using standard interpretive frameworks developed through generations of careful research, but the texts resist complete containment within purely mythological categories. The procedural specificity, the consistency across sources, the emphasis on material components and specialized knowledge, the acknowledgement of experimental failures, these elements seem unusual for pure symbolic theology. Three broad interpretations remain plausible. First, pure mythology. The texts are creative narratives invented to explain human origins within theological framework. Procedural details serve literary purposes. Consistency reflects shared cultural tradition. Material specifications encode symbolic meanings. This interpretation is parsimonious and aligns with scholarly consensus. Second, encoded wisdom. The texts preserve genuine philosophical insights about human nature encoded in narrative form. The clay and blood mixture represents the profound truth that humans combine material physicality with conscious awareness. The procedures describe not biological techniques, but metaphysical processes. This interpretation treats texts as encoding deeper wisdom than surface narrative suggests. Third, garbled memory. The texts preserve, however imperfectly, institutional memories of actual biological modification by entities with advanced knowledge. The Sumerians inherited traditions from earlier peoples who witnessed procedures they could describe only using available vocabulary. Later scribes maintained traditions faithfully because they believed the information documented real events. This interpretation is speculative and faces serious evidentiary challenges, the ambiguity. None of these interpretations can be proven conclusively from texts alone. Each has strengths and weaknesses. Each accommodates some textual features better than others. Each requires assumptions that cannot be verified with certainty. Perhaps all three interpretations capture aspects of truth. Perhaps the texts are simultaneously mythology, encoded wisdom, and garbled memory. Perhaps reality is more complex than any single framework captures. What remains certain is that Sumerian scribes who created and maintained these texts believed they were preserving important information. They invested substantial effort across centuries in copying, translating, and transmitting these creation accounts. They treated them as valuable knowledge. Why such careful preservation? Because the texts addressed fundamental questions. Where do we come from? Why do we exist? What is our purpose? What are our capabilities and limitations? The Sumerian answers may not be literally true in historical or scientific senses, but they represent serious engagement with profound existential issues, sophisticated theological reflection, and possible preservation of information that ancient peoples considered factual. Modern readers must decide what to make of this testimony. We can dismiss it as primitive mythology. We can interpret it symbolically. Or we can take seriously the possibility that ancient peoples were attempting to document something real, even if their documentation is imperfect. The evidence does not compel any single conclusion. The tablets are ambiguous. The cuneiform marks can be read multiple ways. Certainty eludes us. But the question persists, what if the Sumerians knew something we have forgotten? What if their creation accounts preserve not mythology, but memory, however garbled, of actual events that ancient peoples witnessed and considered important enough to record? The possibility cannot be proven. Neither can it be definitively eliminated. The tablets remain silent about their ultimate meaning, preserving procedural descriptions and material specifications and consistency patterns that continue to invite inquiry. CBS 10T73 sits in Philadelphia. The Well-Blundell Prism sits in Oxford. The Atrahasis fragments sit in London. Thousands of other tablets sit in collections worldwide, many still untranslated, some still buried, waiting for future archaeologists. These clay documents have survived wars and floods and the simple erosion of time. They have outlasted the civilizations that created them. The cities lie in ruins. The languages died thousands of years ago. The gods are no longer worshipped. The peoples have vanished. But the tablets remain. The cuneiform marks persist. And the story they tell of clay and blood, of gods and creation, of procedures and materials, of humanity designed for purpose and limited by intention, continues to raise questions that modern knowledge has not yet fully answered. Perhaps the Sumerians were inventing creative mythology. Perhaps they were encoding philosophical insights. Perhaps they were documenting procedures they had witnessed but could not fully comprehend. Or perhaps they were doing all three simultaneously. Perhaps the mythology served religious purposes while also encoding genuine wisdom and preserving historical memory. Perhaps the truth is not either mythology or memory, but both intertwined. The question that remains, 4,000 years after Sumerian scribes impressed these words into clay, is whether we are willing to hold that ambiguity, to resist premature certainty, to acknowledge that ancient testimony may preserve meanings we have not yet fully understood. The tablets do not demand belief, they offer testimony, ancient, fragmentary, ambiguous, but carefully preserved across millennia. Whether that testimony represents myth, wisdom, memory, or some combination, it raises possibilities about human origins that conventional frameworks may not fully accommodate. You are listening to this in darkness, perhaps, in the quiet hours when sleep will not come. The same questions the Sumerians asked 4,000 years ago, the same questions every human asks: where did we come from? Why are we here? What were we meant to be? The Sumerian answer was, we were made deliberately, designed for purpose, created through procedures involving clay and divine essence, granted specific capabilities while denied others, engineered as workers but given enough consciousness to wonder about our own origins. Whether that answer is literally true, symbolically true, or preserving garbled memory of something true remains genuinely uncertain. The evidence permits multiple interpretations. The texts resist definitive decoding. The mystery persists. But the question remains worth asking. What if the Sumerians were right? Not necessarily in every detail, not necessarily in ways they themselves fully understood, but in the fundamental claim that humanity was made, not merely evolved, designed, not merely selected, programmed with specific attributes, not randomly developed. If they were right, even partially, then the implications are profound. We might be not accidents of evolution, but products of intention. Our nature might reflect design decisions rather than adaptive accidents. Our limitations might be boundaries deliberately imposed. Our capabilities might have been granted rather than randomly evolved. These are large claims, unsupported by mainstream evidence, rejected by consensus scholarship, dismissed as fringe speculation. And perhaps rightly so. Perhaps the Sumerians were simply doing what humans do, inventing creative stories to explain the mysterious. But the tablets remain. The cuneiform persists. The consistency across sources continues. The procedural specificity endures. And the careful preservation across centuries testifies to ancient belief that these texts contained information worth maintaining accurately for future generations. We are those future generations. We have knowledge the Sumerians lacked. We can read their tablets, translate their languages, excavate their cities. We know vastly more about reality than they did. Yet they may have known something we have forgotten. They may have inherited traditions from times before writing, times whose events they could only describe using theological vocabulary. They may have been attempting to preserve information that we, with all our science, have not yet recovered. Or they may have been simply creating mythology, doing what humans do, telling stories to explain the mysterious. The ambiguity persists. The question remains open. The tablets preserve their testimony, waiting patiently for future interpreters who might understand better. The clay is cool to the touch. The cuneiform marks catch light at angles. The weight is less than a kilogram, but the question it raises weighs considerably more. What if the Sumerians were documenting, as accurately as their language and understanding allowed, procedures they believed had actually occurred, procedures through which humanity came into being, not through natural evolution alone, but through deliberate modification, conscious design, biological engineering, by entities whose identity remains uncertain, but whose actions, if they occurred, fundamentally shaped what we are? The question remains. The tablets persist. The mystery endures. And perhaps that is sufficient to have asked the question carefully, examined the evidence thoroughly, weighed interpretations fairly, and arrived at genuine uncertainty rather than premature conclusion. Perhaps the honest answer is, we do not yet know for certain what these ancient texts preserve. The Sumerians created something remarkable: civilization, writing, literature, sophisticated theology, mathematical knowledge, astronomical observation, urban culture. They also created these tablets, these careful records of human creation involving clay and blood and divine knowledge. Whether those records are mythology, wisdom, memory, or all three intertwined remains genuinely uncertain. But the records exist. They have survived 4,000 years. And they continue to raise the possibility, however improbable, however unprovable, that humanity's origin story might be stranger and more deliberate than we have yet fully grasped. The cuneiform waits. The clay endures. The question persists. What if the Sumerians were right? Let the question rest as you drift toward sleep. Let consciousness fade as the mystery remains. The tablets have waited 4,000 years. They can wait while you rest. The question will be there when you wake, ancient, unresolved, eternally fascinating. What if we were made, not merely evolved? Designed, not randomly selected, created through procedures preserved in clay by scribes who believed future generations would need to know. The darkness is comfortable, the questions can wait. Sleep comes slowly, but it comes. And in the darkness, the ancient words impressed into Mesopotamian clay 4,000 years ago continue their patient testimony. Clay and blood, gods and procedures, humanity engineered and limited, made for purposes we may never fully comprehend. The tablets rest. The questions remain. And somewhere between mythology and memory, between theology and history, between ancient testimony and modern doubt, the truth about human origins waits to be discovered, or perhaps has already been documented, preserved in cuneiform, waiting only for readers willing to consider possibilities that conventional wisdom has not yet fully explored. Sleep